Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's joining us. I am Kidji Sagin, and I am your moderator for today. I want to welcome you to the second session of the panel on the policy diffusion and policy transfers in East Asia, new unexplored patterns. This panel is part of the International Conference on Policy Diffusion and Development Cooperation, where we examine contemporary issues and discuss cutting edge research about policy transfer, diffusion, and circulation. And today we're going to continue our discussion from last week about the processes, actors involved, and outcomes related to transnational policy transfer within the East Asian region. We are joined today by three presenters who are going to share fascinating case studies in China and the Philippines. And allow me to introduce them based on the chronology of their presentation. First off, let me introduce Dr. Armin Müller of Jacobs University, who is going to talk about provider payment reform for Chinese hospitals. Our second speakers, Richa Shivakoti from Ryerson University and myself, will be discussing the case of the Philippines as a source of knowledge about labor migration policies. Our last speaker for today is Julia Romano from the Institute of East Asian Studies from the University of Duisburg-Essen, who is going to present on policy transfer as a driver of policy change in urban China. Each presenter has 15 minutes for their presentation, to be followed by around 7 minutes of comments or questions from an assigned discussant. The rest of the time will be allocated for questions from the floor. So feel free to post your question on the chat box. And I encourage all of the speakers to stick to their time so that we have a fulfilling discussion. So may I now call on our first speaker, Armin, to give his presentation.
Sorry, can you see my slides? I was still muted. Yeah, I know. All right, so thank you very much. Today I'm going to present you a work in progress of Tobias den Brink and me, which is entitled Hospital Payment Reforms in China's Health Insurance Transfer and Diffusion of International Models. So this is a relatively technical topic, and I try to catch everybody as best as I can, even if you don't have too much background knowledge in health. So in the study of hospital payment methods or provider payment methods, a common frame of reference is the fee-for-service payment method. So that's a retrospective payment method. That means you pay after receiving services, and it has separate accounting for service items and drugs. So basically it means you go to the hospital, and at the end of your stay, you receive a long bill with all the separate services and drugs you consumed, and the correct amount you have to pay for, basically. So this is commonly seen as creating a number of problems. First of all, it creates incentives for doctors to induce demand, as the health economists say. That means to basically over-doctor the patients for profit. And especially if you have a governmental price regulation involved, the pricing of so many different items is difficult to do well, and there is a high likelihood of distortions in the pricing system being present. So in China, fee-for-service payment is predominant, and it's associated with a number of social problems. As most people pay a substantial part of their health costs out of their own pockets. Rising health costs increase the risk of medical bankruptcies or illness-induced poverty, which is a technical term for that. The Chinese government has, since the late 1990s, taken measures to try and protect people from medical bankruptcies, partly through the introduction of health insurance systems. And here we have, importantly, in the urban areas, the urban employees basic medical insurance, and in the rural areas we have the new rural cooperative medical scheme. So those are two separate ones. And once they were in place, what happened is that rising health costs also became a problem for the insurance funds, because a rising burden on the insurance system creates risks for the very decentralized funds to go out of balance or even go bankrupt in a given year. And that creates incentives for local administrators to spring into action. So this is where we come back to the international realm. So we have worldwide a trend in hospital payment reforms away from fee-for-service payment. And that again has two dimensions. First is to go towards prospective payments instead of retrospective, and the other is a bundling of services in the accounting. So what does that look like in practice? You have a couple of ideal typical payment methods for hospitals. The simplest one is global budgets, where, say, a hospital receives 1 million renminbi per month, and that has to be enough for all the patients that come to receive treatment in that month. So it's not really accounting according to how much treatment you provide. Another common payment method is per diem payment. So that means for every patient, every day a patient spends in the hospital will receive, say, 1,000 renminbi, and that has to pay for all that is needed. And since the 1980s, you have a growing international trend towards diagnosis-related groups. That's a little bit more complex. So those are also lump sums, but they're based on the type of disease and also classified according to patient groups. So this is a pretty complex kind of system compared to the other two. Yeah, so against this background, what did we want to know? To what extent have international models of hospital payment reform diffused in China? Which models precisely have spread? Which factors have facilitated the spread? And to what extent have they displaced retrospective payment with prospective payment? And the conceptual framework is essentially a mix of policy transfer and diffusion. With regard to we look at diffusion within the People's Republic of China and at the scope of change in terms of displacing retrospective payment with prospective payment. So some quick points on methodology. We followed a process tracing approach, and we essentially created a database based on a large number of Chinese language publications, mostly case studies and studies within China or reports in newspapers that looked at how these reforms proceeded ever since the 1980s, basically. And yeah, this I'm going to jump. Something about our expectations here. So we had certain expectations of what this would look like. At the central level, we have the Ministry of Health, which manages the rural health insurance. And because they have many health specialists, we thought they will have probably a preference for technically complex policies like DRGs, because it fits their expertise. But the Ministry of Health and its local bureaus also manage the hospitals and represent the hospital's interest. So we also assumed that they would not like too large a scope of change in the system. So they don't want to make too much pressure for the hospitals to cut costs. The urban health insurance is managed by a different ministry, the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security. So they have a lot fewer technical expertise and fewer doctors working there. So we assume they will prefer technically simple models. And because they're not representing interests of hospitals, we assume that they will probably like to have a larger scope of change when it comes to the cost savings at hospital level. And last but not least, very importantly, at the local level, we often have limited administrative capacity, and that limits the scope of change in local implementations. So you have to remember China's health system is very decentralized. It's mostly at county, at city level that these insurances, which adopt these reforms, are organized. So I'm just going to show you 4 hypotheses we made, and the parts highlighted green is what we could confirm, and the red part is what was negated in the process. So we assume that the models diffusing in China are either technically simple models or simplified versions of complex models that we could confirm. But we assumed also that the simple models come with a high degree of transfer that we could not confirm. This is mostly about global budgets, and we found that there are actually indigenous versions which existed already in the planned economy period. So it's impossible to determine whether there has been policy transfer or not. And we also assumed that the complex systems come with a lower degree of transfer, but that we also could not confirm. And this is mostly about DRGs and case-based payments, because simplified versions have already been made in other countries. So it's impossible to say that this has been simplified when it came to China. Yeah, the second hypothesis is that hospital payment models diffuse within China through policy learning and coercion. So those mechanisms are indeed dominant, and in the urban employees basic medical insurance, we have more a trend to learning and horizontal diffusion, whereas in the rural healthcare system, we have a stronger element of hierarchical and coercive practices in which the Ministry of Health and the World Bank delegate certain reforms to locality. Yeah, third, in the urban health insurance, we thought there would be technically simple measures dominating with a high degree of transfer and a high scope of change, reflecting the preferences of the respective ministry in charge. So we could only confirm the first part. So yeah, global budgets do dominate, but they are often not really implemented as prospective payments. So they're lacking the most important component, which means in practice they solve the problems of the local government because they stop spending at a certain point, but they don't change the incentives of the hospitals and don't solve the problems of the patients actually. And yeah, the fourth, for the rural health insurance, we assumed there would be more complex measures with a small degree of transfer and a small scope of change that reflects the preferences of the Ministry of Health, and which are severely limited by local state capacity. And most of the time we could confirm that. So we have a dominance of very simplified versions of DRGs, of case-based payment, and quite often we have an absence of prospective elements here. So what you see is actually not lump sums being paid, but just maximum prices being dictated for certain types of treatment. And so this we could by and large confirm. And yeah, I know that was probably a lot of content pretty fast in a short amount of time. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to receive comments and feedback right now or also via email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Armin, for really finishing on time. I may now call on Richa to give her comments and questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Armin, for your presentation. It was quite complex for me. It was the first time learning about Chinese health systems, but I learned a lot from your paper. I had a few comments and maybe a question also regarding your presentation. Firstly, the policy transfer and diffusion that you showed was very interesting. That is happening in China. It's not something we hear about or learn about as much. On the issue about the process tracing, I wanted to ask you maybe if you could explain a little bit more on what you did, because you said you looked at 500 or so Chinese documents. And these were what kind of documents you looked at to see this tracing of differences in the policy over time, and also what was being transferred and where. And also, if you could, when you say technically simple models, are you talking about the global budget and per diem and not the diagnosis related groups? And what also the question, a clarification, if you could, about why it was the case that there was more learning in the urban method, I think, and why it was more coercion. And what do you mean by coercion, basically, on the rural side of the rural model? If you could explain a little bit about these two. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the comments. Okay, so first, what did we do? We made a big collection of all the, well, not everything, but say the qualitatively more, the higher quality studies you can find in Chinese academic publications, magazines, and newspapers. So there's an online database which gives you access to the CNKI, which is the China National Knowledge Infrastructure, I think is what it means. So you get access to large databases of publications, and there you can essentially Google search for the specific buzzwords and then look for different reforms when they have been made. So the background is a little bit that in recent years you have a strong drive towards these reforms, and they're being presented as something which is kind of new and is going to make a lot of change. But then if you look at it a bit more in detail, you realize that actually these kind of reforms have been going on for quite a while in a number of different places. So we got some 500 or so articles, most of them academic publications discussing hospital payment reforms and then naming examples where and how they have been implemented. And we put them in a case database. So we made case sections for localities at city and at county level. And then we collected all the information we could get by place. We ended up with some places with very dense descriptions, so with lots of publications discussing what has been done there. That's mostly model experiments and that thing. But it's not, you don't get a complete longitudinal profile. And then essentially we focused for the process tracing, we focused on the cases which are well described to trace how these models were first adopted in China and how they developed then later on when being applied in different places. And technically simple models means overall easy to implement. So real DRGs are not easy to implement, and most certainly not at a local level. I mean, that's something, if you want to do it right, you have to do it at national level, and this is not how these reforms work. Global budgets are comparatively easy to do. Whether they're easy to do well is another question. Per diem is easy to do. And then what's also quite prevalent, especially in the rural areas, is a kind of single disease pricing. So you kind of make exceptions to fee-for-service when you create lump sums or price caps for a limited number of specific treatments, like, for example, a surgery for an appendix inflammation, a surgery for appendix inflammation, or something like that. So this is in principle somewhat related to DRGs, but it's a very simplified form. But then in China, it's often called the same name. So when they talk about the reforms, you don't know for sure at first whether they talk about just having a couple of illnesses with a price cap or whether they're actually trying to do a real DRG system. This is one of the reasons why we focus in the end of the day very much on the well-documented cases, because a lot of the times the descriptions are so vague that it's not always completely clear what they do. But then on the other hand, if they do something meaningful at a local level, usually the governments promote it. So if a local government does a big experiment, they usually make a lot of marketing for that. And if they really do something which is meaningful, usually you hear of it. If they do something just to comply to central measures, you get more these kind of, okay, we did this and that, and then you get the buzzword, but not a lot of information. Okay, then last, why learning in the urban areas and coercion in the rural areas. The urban areas, especially in the coastal areas, they're more exposed to international knowledge. They started these things earlier on. And I think they also have a politically more powerful position within China, which facilitates more this kind of horizontal learning, one praise from the other. Although there has also been coordination from the central level, I would just say that in the rural areas, that's a lot stronger because, they have less exposure to the external world. So the knowledge they receive comes more through the bureaucracy of the Ministry of Health. And the kind of reforms they do are more kind of along the lines of the agenda of the Ministry of Health. And because the international organizations like the World Bank, they have more engagement in the poorer rural areas, they don't deal with urban health insurance so much. So they play a role basically only for the rural areas, and there they put in a little bit of their technical knowledge and assistance and also some of their agendas, and they've been also very much promoting these reforms. So this is why this kind of hierarchical mechanisms are more important there, and they're somewhat more coercive than the horizontal learning ones. Though you shouldn't think of it as something where really the central forces a specific locality to do that. There's also a lot of coordination involved. So there is yet another question in the.
Yeah, I can maybe read it for you.
Okay, yeah.
Like,
that would be great.
and this
Thanks.
question is from Julia, and she's interested in understanding like what is the origin of the models transferred in China, and in particular, from where did China learn the various simplified approaches that it imported from other countries?
Yeah, this is not in every place entirely clear. I mean, as I already said, for global budgets, it's been next to impossible to determine because these are so simple. I mean, already in the planned economy, they had something which is effectively the same kind of mechanism in order to save costs. And you have incidences of local governments, which in 1 year they introduce a classical measure inspired by the planned economy period. And the next year, the central government puts out a policy document saying we want provider payment reforms. And then they start reinterpreting this as a global budget, as an international model. So in that area, it's pretty difficult. In other areas, it's somewhat easier. For example, for this kind of payment by bad days was originally, the first time we could trace it was in Shenzhen, and it was adopted at the time when a similar model was applied in a very different context, though in Hong Kong. And Shenzhen and Hong Kong are right next to each other. So from my perspective, it's reasonable to assume that Shenzhen adopted that from neighboring Hong Kong. And some of the simplified lump sums for some illnesses, which are kind of presented as a simplified DRG version, was, I mean, in the area, the first application I know of was in Taiwan, when Taiwan introduced a universal health insurance in the 1990s. They started that around 1995. And then in 1997, it began to appear in pilots for Chinese urban health insurance. So we don't really have the smoking gun, but I think it's a lot more likely that the pilots for urban health insurance adopted this idea from Taiwan than them reinventing the wheel about it. But then, of course, Taiwan probably got the idea from the United States, where models like this were already in use in the 1980s, but they have not been marketed as much. So if you look at international organizations, what they promote is a more the three ideal typical ones that I presented before for inpatient services. And then there are also a couple of other ones for outpatient services, but it would get even more information if we included those as well. So I hope that answers the question.
So we have a bit of more time, so I can probably ask you a couple of questions that I have here. I actually like your point about the fact that there is potentially displacement of the previously working health insurance. But I'm curious about how that relates to the degrees of transfer that you were talking about. Are they more likely to be synthesized, or are they more likely to be reinterpreted? Because if there are, for example, very strong path-dependent features of the old system in that particular city, do you think the changes would be largely, or the transfer would be largely incremental? And maybe I can throw this second question that is similar to the earlier question. I was just curious about like who was doing the learning, or who was doing the transfer in that sense, like or the diffusion. And by that, I'm wondering, is there a way by which the ministry tries to encourage this kind of learning, or is it purely driven by all these county or city governments?
Okay, thank you very much. So for the first question, we assumed a connection between displacement, between the scope of change and the degree of transfer, because that has been suggested by Rose in his original writings on that, and we didn't find that at all. So you have some reforms with a high degree of transfer, some reforms with a low degree of transfer, but most of the time, except for some model experiments, there was not really a large scope of change. So the vast majority of those reforms actually did not really displace fee-for-service payment for most of the insurance reimbursement. So fee-for-service remains in place for a lot of what individuals have to pay for themselves, of course, but then also for the majority of insurance reimbursements, as far as we can tell that from the information that is out there. And the path dependence here is, I think, mostly connected to state capacity and interests. So the question is whether you have enough money to pay for hospitals providing those services, and whether you actually want to spend it on that, or whether you want to spend it on, say, building new houses or something like that. And then, yeah, who does the learning or who does the transfer? The very early ones, so basically the first points of application have been done by local governments. So this is then usually local departments of health or local departments of labor, which have been the first to try out insurance systems, and often before there was really a national program. Depends a little bit how far you want to trace it back, but at first it's always the localities. But then later on, and especially in the rural areas, once you have a national insurance program in place, then also the ministry at national level starts to play a stronger role in this. So as soon as you have a national program, then you also get national level policies, which are then supposed to be implemented across the board. But it's a bit a mixture of two, both in the rural and the urban areas. It's just in the rural areas, the centralized or vertical component is more heavy, and there is also more steering in the reforms. Whereas in the urban areas, there was a lot going on already when they just had some local experiments before there was really a national policy about rolling out a health insurance system.
Yeah, so I think that's a fascinating point, that a lot of local policy experiments are eventually being used to diffuse policies. And I think it links well to sort of like this Chinese style of policy making, where you do a lot of smaller scale policy experiments. And that's the case for a lot of urban management policies, such as like waste management. And I think it dovetails well with this discussion about healthcare also being used as a site of policy experiments, and that being diffused eventually. So there's natural mix of central local dynamics in the diffusion process. So I think it's a fascinating case that you have it here. So thank you, Armin, for that discussion. Do we have additional questions? Let me just quickly check on. Okay. No. Okay. So I think we can now proceed to our next presentation, and that will be Richa and me. So let me just quickly share my screen. Okay, so I think you should be able to see my screen now. So we're going to talk about, now I think we're just gonna quickly shift from the discussion about receiving transfer in that sense to actually exporting policies particularly from a developing country. And that's why we're quite interested in it. Why do countries from the global south try to export policies? And we're gonna situate the discussion around the Philippines and its role as a source of knowledge on labor migration policies. So as I mentioned, I'm going to do this presentation with Richa, who joins us from the US. So just a bit of context about labor migration. We know that this has been increasing in the past few years, and a lot a lot of the international migrants are basically labor migrants or contract workers, and a lot of this kind of labor migration is actually within what they call South-South, between developing countries. Around 30% of this labor migration is within the global South, and some other 30% is from South to the global North. And this is buttressed by this idea that a lot of these countries rely on labor migration as a way to support economic growth. As you can see in this particular slide here, remittances account for a huge part of income in these countries, and it's 3 times the worth of official development assistance. It is probably more stable than private investments. So part of the reason why there's this increasing labor migration is this reliance on remittances by these low and middle income countries. One thing that emerged out of this discussion is this growing convergence of migration policy, particularly in OECD countries, basically because they sort of share similar economic structures and foreign policy structures. And it has eventually led to this idea of a migration state, where these countries from the West, more neoliberal capitalist countries, have migration as a very salient policy agenda, that it sort of like is one of the biggest consideration of the state, of the politics of the state. But the convergence in migration policies, particularly emigration policies from sending countries, is actually poorly understood. And we find that there are probably two ambiguous outcomes. One is probably convergent as a result of international agreements that has been coming around since the past 10 years. Last week, we had a discussion about ILO playing a huge role in labor reforms, and this is the case also with labor migration. But it also could be divergent in the sense that different approaches to labor migration is a function of the different migration population profile and state capacity, that not all countries could actually influence migration policies or could actually reform their own domestic policies. But one thing that we know is that this kind of convergence among developing countries would probably depend on the transnational activities of sending countries. But we know that this is largely missing. We poorly understand this phenomenon. So this has led us to do this particular study. We wanted to understand what, how, and why governments from developing countries successfully diffuse policy. So this is like the overarching question that we're trying to answer. And we're doing this by analyzing the strategies for transnational activities of the Philippines in diffusing migration policies. And we're going to use 3 illustrative examples where the Philippines has been particularly active in influencing the transnational policymaking of these different sectors. We wanted to frame our discussion based on this sort of like outward policy transfer, like how countries from the global South actually project policies outside their borders. And it's a bit of a puzzle because these countries lie in the semi-periphery of what they will call a global agora for policies. So they don't necessarily have the influence to significantly change international agreements, but they still do a lot of transnational activities. And some of the existing consensus, or at least channels by which these countries send policies abroad, can be categorized into 4 different channels. First is this larger promotion of counter-hegemonic ideas. So it's sort of trying to counter or contradict the sort of Washington consensus. And you can see this in the formation of the BRICS, or like platforms where a lot of the LMICs would try to share practices. And in particular, we find that the World Social Forum that was created in Brazil to be a particular source of counter-hegemonic ideas. And one instrument that has been spread as a result of this motivation is participatory budgeting. The second channel is this is related to the more recent development with the spread of the Chinese model of development, where it's basically linked to the projection of soft power through norm diffusion. So this is how the Chinese does aid. And soft power in terms of like creating legitimacy for their rise in the global arena. The third point here is that the transnational activities, such as policy transfer, actually feeds back to the legitimation of domestic policies. And this has been established in the case of Bolsa Familia, where projection outward of domestic policy actually improves the perception about Bolsa Familia, in this particular case in Brazil. And the last channel is a more rational approach to understanding how they send abroad. It's basically to foster mutual learning. Basically, they want to just exchange the best practices. Just it's largely facilitated by South-South development cooperation. But for us, all of these motivations seem to point to the idea of nation building. And a lot of the countries from the global South have largely incomplete state development. So we wanted to turn into Philippines as a development migration state, where there is this relationship between being a migration state to actually pursuing development. And this has been happened in the Philippines for over 40 years, where they linked international labor migration with economic development. And some of the notable policies here are linked to ensuring that there is efficient migration control. So, for example, regulation of recruitment agencies to ensure that we are able to send labor out. But also increasingly, there is this cash assistance or social protection aspects to labor migration. So the idea of a developmental migration state is that the state derive legitimacy from the link between migration and development. We know that in the Philippines, remittances keep the economy afloat, particularly during the global financial crisis. And governments have been using the political rhetoric to, for example, identify migrant workers as new heroes. So here I just identified some of the statements of previous governments where they look at, for example, labor migration as trying to turn it to be a choice rather than a necessity. So we're doing something about it, but we're actually not doing anything about it. And, so this has been used by the government as imperative to engage in transnational strategies for migration affairs. It essentially is about a transnationalization of a domestic policy problem. Initially, it was about unemployment, but now it's many different things. So what they did was to basically create this transnational bureaucratic structures where migrants' affairs are at the center of the foreign affairs activities of the government. They've started to deliver public services. So, for example, as I mentioned to you, cash assistance. They've done labor placement, things that you'd normally see in the domestic sphere being transported transnationally. And lastly, they've engaged with the involvement of non-state actors. Businesses, particular recruitment agencies, are very much involved, and NGOs provide social assistance. But these services do not necessarily feed into sort of the resource environments. And so the government has turned to doing transnational policy transfer to influence policies abroad. And we're going to demonstrate this with our examples that Richa is going to talk about.
Next slide, please. So for the examples of policy diffusion from the Philippines, we wanted to talk about the migration development nexus and how the Philippines has bought into this win-win-win narrative that labor migration is beneficial or can be beneficial to the migrant worker, to the country of origin and the country of destination if it is managed well. The focus so then becomes on the management or the governance of the mechanisms to support labor migration. And Philippines has really worked very hard to create this strong governmental institutions to support the export of labor. And the government is also known to be heavily involved in the process. And it's also quite involved in migration diplomacy and advocacy at the national, regional, and global level. So it's been active in the Global Forum for Migration and Development. It's hosted the second GFMD conference in 2008 in Manila. It's also one of the countries to endorse the Global Compact for safe and orderly and regular migration in 2018. And they've already said that they're mainstreaming the GCM into the Philippine Development Plan for 2016 to 2021. And it's always, been one of the first Asian country to sign and ratify UN conventions that are related to migration, even the one that is on the rights of migrant workers and members of their families, which only has 56 state parties, and the Philippines is one of them. At the regional level, they're very active in the regional consultative processes, especially the one that work on the management of temporary contractual labor employment in Asia. So these are the Abu Dhabi dialogue and the Colombo process. Finally, the Philippines has also been very proactive in negotiating bilateral labor agreements as well as MOUs with destination countries, and even including some at the provincial level. So they really have these agreements on exporting labor migrants in this different countries and regions, basically. So for the next slide, Kiji. And one very interesting aspect of the Philippines is that the government has really worked to extend its reach at the destination country. So it's been successful in doing that by finding innovative ways to support their migrant workers in destination countries. So they have the one country, one team approach, which means that at the embassy, they work with different officers and representatives from different mother agencies in the Philippines and work as one country within the mission under the leadership of the ambassador to work for the protection of Filipino migrant workers. They have the Department of Labor and Employment has established various offices called the Philippine Overseas Labor Offices in selected destination countries that have large number of migrant workers there. And these offices are headed by labor attaches who supervise labor officials at post at the embassies and manage any difficulties related to foreign migrant workers there. And they also have social welfare attaches, who are responsible for assisting and managing any issues that come up with Filipino workers in distress, trafficking victims, abandoned children, these kind of social issues also. So they have a big reach at the destination country, and especially in countries in the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, they have several offices that are there to support their migrant workers there. And lastly, I also want to talk about the joint and solidarity liability, which is a very interesting legal issue that is to address the access of justice, which is a big problem when workers are terminated from their jobs and have to leave the country. They cannot, there's no way to seek compensation for their time and work and money with foreign employers. So the government has this policy, the JSL, which means that both the private agency and the foreign principal or employer, the one in Philippines and the foreign employer, can be held individually liable for the entire amount of claim or obligation due to the foreign migrant worker if needed. So the idea is hopefully that recruitment agencies are better prepared to support them. So the next slide, Kiji. Another important transfer is the pre-departure orientation seminars that are educational programs that provide basic information to departing migrant workers. And this has been seen as a success, the seminars. And other countries, Asian countries, have also emulated this process. But the Philippine government now has expanded on the pre-departure orientation seminar, and also has 2 other supplementary programs that are not mandatory. One is the pre-employment seminar and the post-arrival orientation seminar. So even after you get to the country of destination, there's a seminar to support and give information to migrants. And this has been seen as best practice, and the Philippines is now active in promoting the PDOS, but also the PEOS and the PAOS as a comprehensive package in preparing migrant workers. And they've done this in the Colombo process and the Abu Dhabi dialogue, the regional consultative processes, to establish a regional model of streamlined orientation and to produce a regional guide. And they've done this through pilot projects and such. So the next slide, Kiji. So what is being transferred here? The government is engaged in diffusing various elements of its labor migration policy in both host country and the sending country. And I think this is an important issue with the Philippines. And even, they have these abstract models of how multilateral labor migration management should work. And even if the country of destination do not sign these UN conventions, the Philippines has signed it. And this is entry point on asking for more rights and all of that. The Philippines also has a pragmatic mix of strong state role with extensive involvement of the market and NGOs for service provisions for the migrant workers. In the sending countries, they have specific instruments like the PDOS or even the regional orientation programs to prepare migrant workers. And for the host countries, they're really extending their reach to support their own migrant workers. So why is it being transferred? And the issue comes back to what Kiji was talking about, the development migration state. They have both the rational and a political motivation to drive policy transfer of immigration policies. They can, promote specific ideas or ideals about international management of labor migration. And this reinforces the country's position as a top labor sending country, that it's sending better and more trained migrant workers who are in high demand in countries of destination. So they're not even competing for the same jobs and pays in some cases. And the national, regional, and international stance of migration, it really feedbacks into the legitimacy of the development migration state. But still, the narrative is that if migration is manageable, and if you learn how to do that from us, then migration will be beneficial. I think that's a legitimacy role in the developmental state. So I'll try to, and also the involvement of non-state actors also helps in the legitimacy. So for the next slide, I'm writing that. So how is that being transferred? The participation in role differentiated policy transfer networks, and in the regional consultative processes, the instrument constituency, and they also have the focus on the formation of the epistemic community. So their early involvement and inclusion in the GFMD, or the active participation in the regional consultative processes, and the maintenance of advocacy coalitions. So the use of migration diplomacy to lobby with host countries about key issues abroad. And they have used some interesting policies like the migration ban to negotiate for better terms for their migrant workers before lifting the ban. So in conclusion, the country really has taken advantage of its position as a global model for the migration management of its policies there related, and its dominance in certain labor markets to push for the spread of various elements of its management of migration policies. And it also engages in transnational policy transfer activities to reinforce its status as a developmental migration state. And this really derives legitimacy not only by successfully exporting the labor migrants abroad, but also in exporting its policies for managing the transnational workers. Sorry, we're a little over time.
Yes.
Yes.
So thank you, Richa. Thank you for giving us a little bit of time. Okay. So let me just. I would now like to turn to Armin for his questions.
Thank you very much at first for this, very interesting presentation. This is an important and very understudied topic, and there is a lot of ground to cross in that field. So I'm very happy to see this. I have a couple of comments. One of the so it's a large field, and there is a lot of ground to cover, and I would encourage you to kind of. Sorry for a second, my battery is running out. I would encourage you to maybe think about the framing a little bit. So right now, what it does, from my perspective, is connecting two things. So the one is kind of more classical diffusion and policy transfer oriented research, and another aspect is, at least from my perspective, transnational social protection or transnational social policy. So for example, if an embassy overseas provides services to migrant workers, I'm not sure if that really falls under policy transfer. So at some point, the separation has not been entirely clear to me. So I would encourage you to kind of frame that in a way which distinguishes these things more clearly, and that goes also together with the level of analysis. So I think the really classical diffusion or transfer oriented aspects were more directed to international fora and classical kind of multilateral activities, so more to an international or supranational level of analysis, whereas the social service provision is more at the transnational level, so directly between different nations. And maybe one way of doing that is to frame the whole thing as, I mean, some people talk about these things as diaspora policy. So maybe this is a heading which can serve as a unifier under which then different activities can be discussed, which include policy transfer and diffusion, but also transnational service provision, which does not necessarily lead to another country adopting any ideas or policies, but may still be of assistance to the people in to the out migrants. Okay, the second point is that when I go through the presentation, I see a lot of concepts. And so far, I mean, I haven't really seen a manuscript, so I don't know how you intend to use them, but maybe you want to think about which of the concepts you really need for the argument that you make, and whether you can drop a couple of them, especially in the end. You for example, you turn to advocacy coalitions and epistemic communities, and I mean, of course, on the one hand, everybody knows what it is. Then on the other hand, really putting the definitions and talking, I mean, saying specifically who you mean by that, and if you do that for a lot of different concepts, that may overburden the paper a little bit. So I try to slim it concept-wise and streamline it towards one central line of argumentation. So among these concepts is then also you have the developmental state, you have the migration state, diffusion, policy transfer. So there is a lot of stuff which potentially, again, I would have to see the manuscript, but it's probably hard to put a definition and operationalization and then prove the existence of all of these. And in the beginning, that's then the third point, and the rest is really more smaller points. You talk about global convergence, and I wasn't entirely sure at the beginning, especially what converges or what diverges, and how that has to do with the agency of migration states. So it became a little bit clearer in the process, but in the beginning I found it a bit confusing. And in the end, you also talk more specifically about what precisely does diffuse, and from where to where, and what mechanisms are involved. But in the beginning, I found that lacking a little bit. So in the beginning, I was looking a little bit for orientation to know where the direction is going. Then you also talked a lot about, in the beginning, about migrants from lower middle income countries to OECD countries. And that's, of course, an important stream of global migration. But then in this day and age, you also have a lot of migrants going to countries which are not necessarily OECD. So China is one target regions, but then there are also places like Malaysia and others where you find a lot of people also from the Philippines, I suppose, but which are not really in the OECD section. And I wonder whether that makes a difference, or whether that's whether or not that makes a difference for your argument. Then you refer to the China model and soft power. Again, I would have to see it in the manuscript, I guess, but there is a discussion whether there really is something such as a China model, whether or not that really exists. So yeah, I would have to see how you use it in the paper, but I would be careful with that concept. And in the course of the presentation, again, it became, I think, a little clearer towards the end, but precisely how the Filipino government or different departments try to influence overseas policies was not always clear to me in all parts of the presentation. So there are many different elements, and yeah, that brings me back to my first comment. So try to find a framing which puts a bit more order in these many and diverse and very interesting pieces of information that you presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Armin. Maybe, Richard, do you have anything to say first, or as a response?
Sure. I mean, I think those are all great points. Thank you. I understand we tried to put in a lot of topics and things. I think this article might become, might be something to do more than one article by unpacking the different concepts that we are introducing. So I agree that we can try to do that better. So for the issue about the level of analysis, I found that comment interesting that you just said about the policy transfer diffusion, but also the country-to-country transnational provision of services by the embassy. So that's an interesting point for us to consider. There's some, I think the policy diffusion and all of that we talked about, how you also asked about how the governments are trying to influence other governments. It's more through these regional and international forums where they are presenting their cases as best practices that you can learn from. This has worked for us in the Philippines, and they really worked with institutions like the IOM and ILO as intermediaries, where they are, presenting their cases, but also where they're doing pilot projects in other countries or supporting other countries, like smaller countries that are recently moving to export labor from their countries, like Cambodia or Myanmar, where the Philippines is supporting them in certain policies on like the pre-deployment orientation seminars. And they've done this through the ILO or IOM agencies, and also presenting their cases at the Abu Dhabi Dialogue and the Colombo process over time on what has worked. So that is more at the international or the regional level, where they really try to promote their own examples there. But the transnational level social service provision is important. As you said, they're doing this all in the embassies because there are problems there that the host countries are not supporting labor migrants enough when they are in distress. So that is the reason the Philippines government has to go and give more support, especially this is seen in the Gulf countries, where there has just the number of problems that is seen there is just quite large in comparison to other places. So, and the Gulf countries also have these restrictive kafala laws that are not supportive, are quite restrictive, let's say, for migrant workers. And this is why the Philippines has had to reach, it's not that they wanted to, but they really had to extend their reach in these countries to support their own migrant workers. So this transnational level of social service provision is an important thing, but because of these internal problems in the host countries, the Philippines is doing this, but also other labor sending countries are also learning from the Philippines and saying, okay, we also need to do more at the embassy to support our own migrant workers who come to the embassy to ask for support when there is so much trouble. But Philippines has done it for longer. They've learned from their experiences over time, and they've also put in a lot more maybe money compared to some other smaller states from Asia. So this is also a learning process for them.
Okay. Thank you, Richa. I will now call Julia for her questions.
Sorry, my mic was muted. So thank you, Kiji, and thank you very much to both of you for this for this great presentation, for this great case study. And I join Armin in saying that we need more studies on other countries transferring their policies beyond the ones that we already know. So it's your contribution is very valuable. I have a question. My set of questions actually rotates around the origins, or the process that led to the creation of this, let's call it this new global model for the management of migration. Concerning, first of all, the time span, in which timeline, what are the years in which the Philippines have begun developing this type of policies, or which have been the main triggers? And then you pointed out in the presentation you talked about the China model, and Armin also made a comment about that, questioning whether there really exists a China model. And if you look at the literature on this topic, you see that scholars agree in saying that what is called the China model, it's a mixture of lessons learned from abroad mixed up together with the experience of the country. So the question that I would like to ask you is to know a little bit about the ingredients of this model. Have the Philippines also learned from other countries from abroad in the shaping of these policies? And so what have been the different components and elements that led to the development of this Philippine model? These are my questions.
I can answer the first part of the question, and maybe Kiji can talk about the China model and others. So for the Philippines, the model of migration management, it started earlier than many countries because it started the export of labor migrants from the 1970s and has been very active since then. So, in the beginning, it's not that it has been model and was very supportive of its migrant workers as such. In the 70s, it sent a lot of migrant workers to the Gulf states. And since even till now, the Gulf countries are one of the major countries of destination, but also Southeast Asia and also the West, and over time, Philippines has also they're also sending labor migrants, but also more highly educated and different types of migrants over time. I think the triggers, Philippines has had a few of those. It's based on the large number of migrant workers going there, but also the large amount of cases that are in the media because of abuse or death or things like that, and these have been triggers over time to change policy to protect migrant workers. And this is because there's a large demand for migrants and migrant families for their conditions and all of that. So in 1995, the Flor Contemplacion case in Singapore, where she had. Sorry, Kiji, I don't know if you want to explain the case, but there was a case in Singapore where she was in death row, I think, because of a issue with a child in her protection. There was a death of the child. So based on that, there was a real outrage in the country with the population, and that really led to many changes in migrant protection policies. So over time, they've added protection measures. They've added pre-deployment support services. Even after coming back, there are other services that are there to support the reintegration migrants or for them to go back. So this global model for the Philippines has really, took an effect over time since the 70s. Kiji.
Yeah, I mean the cases was about for contemplation where she was executed for murder of a fellow Filipina. And so that caused a lot of diplomatic tension with Philippines and Singapore because she was still executed despite diplomatic appeals by the government. And this is sort of the one that really triggered a lot of policies to protect the welfare of the Filipinos abroad. So that's sort of like the origin story, particularly in 1995, where they introduced this fairly sophisticated migration management model. I think I just want to really appreciate the show appreciation of the comments. This is sort of like a paper that is like a third of a series of papers. So we put everything into one presentation so that it has established a discussion. So basically, the argument is that the developmental migration state does transnational activities in two ways. One is through policy transfer, and the other one is transnational service provision. And this particular paper, we wanted to develop further the idea of policy transfer to ensure that migrant workers are adequately protected. So that's pretty much the idea that you want to influence policies in both host and other sending countries so that it creates like a bandwagoning effect. And this is particularly the case for example, minimum wage for domestic workers. That has sort of like spilled over from one country to another, and also from sending countries demanding for such minimum wage. There are also cases, I think, just to address Julia's question about whether the Philippines have learned from other countries. Pakistan also did a similar labor migration promotion in 70s. And I think one example that I think there was some learning with the Philippines is the welfare fund. So like sort of like a trade union for migrant workers, where it's used to provide social services to a lot of the migrant workers abroad. So I think just to address also like an additional question by Armin here, this welfare fund is being used to finance these transnational service provision. So providing shelter to displaced or distressed migrant workers. It's becoming more common in these sending countries. So Pakistan, Nepal has tried to do this, but I would say that it's still a little bit of an exceptional case for the Philippines to do a very expansive social service provision that includes labor, employment, social assistance, and even legal provision. So I would say that some elements of it have been diffusing, but as we try to argue, the idea of migration management control through a transnational approach is something that's being spread. Okay, so I think we can wrap up our discussion on that paper, and I'm really appreciative, and we'll definitely take these comments into consideration. Maybe we can now move on to our last presentation for today. I would like to call on Julia to present on her paper.
Again, my mic is muted. Okay, thank you, Kiji. So again, hi, everybody, and I'm very happy to meet again virtually after the first session of this panel. So the elements that I am sharing with you today are not what is actually presented in the conference program, because that's still a lot of work in progress, but another topic which is based on my on a research that I've conducted during my doctoral studies, and in which I finally updated between 2018 and 2019. As a postdoc researcher. And I did this because the case that I studied is a case that allows us to explore policy transfers in their long-term effects. And therefore, it permits us to connect with the important questions of persistence and performance, which have been put forward by Wade Jacoby in this insightful analysis of policy transfers from the US to West Germany. So talking about the persistence and the performance of policy transfers means looking at whether the approaches which have been introduced via policy transfers and then adapted locally, they get institutionalized, they get rooted in the locality where they've been adopted, and also get accepted by the local society. So the question is whether they are sustainable. Next slide, please. So my research in particular focused on the transfer and local adaptation of a concept of urban conservation and renewal, which was developed in West Berlin in 1970s and 1980s, and then was proposed to the Chinese city of Yanzhou in China in the early 2000s by the German cooperation agency GTZ, which today is known as GIZ. And this was done via a multi-year cooperation project between 2003 and 2007, in which GTZ involved the local administration in a variety of activities to promote inter alia this model of urban renewal. The overall analysis of this case study is based on a longitudinal study, an in-depth study, which was done over the period 2000 to 2019, in which I explored a variety of questions pertaining to what has been transferred and how, what is the object of transfer, and then to what the outcomes of these transfers have been, focusing in particular on the activities of policy learning and policy translation of the local administration in Yanzhou. But what we're going to see today, of course, is just a part of this long story. And in particular, I would like to reflect a little bit on the question of sustainability of what has been transferred, and so the policies and approaches which have been introduced with the local translation process. To begin with the treatise, actually, I would like just to say a couple of words about this transfer object. What is it about? This concept of urban conservation and renewal, which I'm referring to, is called Care for Urban Renewal, which is an imprecise translation of the German Behutsamestadt Erneuerung. And it is basically an approach of urban renewal which is careful to the existing buildings, careful to the existing uses of the space and the existing urban layout, as well as to the needs and the requirements of the residents. So we can understand this as a participatory approach to urban renewal that gives priority mostly to conservation and upgrading, and of course to the wishes of the residents, rather than intervening with very radical remakes of the space and changes also of the population that uses the space. It is also actually an ecological approach to urban renewal, because when it has been developed in West Berlin in the 1970s, the architects at the time, they tried to introduce for the first time ecological solutions that aimed at reducing the consumption of energy, material and water in building construction. And then many of these practices eventually became law in Germany in the 1980s. So the case of the transfer of this concept to the city of Yanzhou, I think it's an interesting case study to explore actually what happens in one of those bilateral cooperation projects which China has established in the past 2 decades with many other countries to explore concepts such as sustainable urban development or eco-city development of low-carbon development. And this research precisely was an attempt at studying what happens in these collaborative projects, and then what has been learned from abroad, and what concepts and ideas have been transferred, and then whether this can find a useful application in another context. And finally, then what happens to these ideas in the long run. So next slide, please. So these are more or less actually the questions that I would like to cover today, specifically going very rapidly through the impacts of international cooperation, therefore answering to the question of what has been learned from abroad. And then we will look at the second question, which is interested in knowing whether exactly these concepts coming from abroad are then adaptable or can be adopted in another context, in another very different context. And then finally, I would like to make some comments on the rooting or this institutionalization of what has been learned in this process, which is the core question of this presentation. Next slide. So first question, what has been learned from abroad? Well, actually, when I really have to shorten a lot, but when GTZ cooperated with Yangzhou, it made a quite fine-grained analysis of the situation of and the needs of the Yangzhou Old City, which is actually the area where this approach was supposed to be applied, and as well as of the needs of the residents. And all these studies have been done to identify basically where to introduce some policy recommendations. Then at the end of this experience, GTZ conducted some pilot projects to test with this model. And in 2007, it also offered a series of policy recommendations and a strategy for the conservation and upgrading of the old city, hoping that later on, the city administration would have considered this recommendation and would have slowly initiated a process of reform of its renewal policies. However, you have to know that the proposals that were made by GTZ in those years were really quite different from the approach which was followed that far by the administration. What does this mean? Actually, at the beginning of the year 2000, Yangzhou was convinced of transforming its old city in a touristic attraction. And to do so, it actually planned to intervene quite heavily on the existing spaces to change their functions, so from residential to commercial, as well as their aspects and their users. And this meant actually very bluntly to relocate the residents and to renovate some protected heritage units and historical buildings to reuse them as touristic spaces, and then to demolish housing which the administration considered being of lower or no architectural value in order to construct new buildings in fake antique style. These types of intervention actually found application everywhere in China. And so you can understand that what GTZ wanted to propose to the city of Yangzhou was a completely different paradigm of urban renewal. And you can also imagine that in order to have a change of this type, you need quite long time. You need changes not only in the goals of policy renewal, in the policy goals, but also a change of the management of renewal in the city. And this type of change, of course, need the support of different levels of the government. And we can actually call them as third order type of changes using the famous definition by Peter Hall. Next slide. Therefore, given these different understandings, it was clear that at the end of the cooperation project, it was not possible to expect a successful transfer of care for urban renewal. And this was not so different, I would say, from the findings of the existing literature. In general, we can say that cooperation projects do not automatically translate into visible policy effects. And for that to happen, they need to establish some favorable conditions. Namely, there have to appear certain pressing problems, and there have to be willing policymakers which are in the right position in the right moment to propose a policy solution into a feasible option for the government, and in this way then establish an autonomous process of policy making and policy learning. And this is actually what happened in Yangzhou some years after the cooperation agency left. And this is actually what I wrote in the paper that I share with you today. But given actually the discussions that we already began last week, I actually decided to highlight something else of this long story. So briefly just to say a couple of words about what happened. So we had to wait until 2010 for a significant administrative reorganization to happen in Yangzhou, and hence for a policy window to open. And actually this administrative reorganization shifted a part of the planning and the construction bureau of Yangzhou at the head of a special organization which has been created by the new party secretary to conduct research and develop new policies for the old city. And this unit, which was called the Old City Office, was headed by an official who had previously worked with GTZ. And between 2010 and 2013, this person began leading studies, contributed to the development of new policies and new plans for the old city, and led also other pilot projects that try to replicate this participatory approach of urban renewal as it has been experimented with GTZ. We can say that the policy documents and the plans established in those years somehow represent, in a certain way, a translation of the recommendations which have been made by GTZ. And here we go actually to the second question of my presentation, which is definitely interested in knowing whether concepts and ideas which have been developed elsewhere, in this case in Germany, could find a useful application also in a context like a Chinese city like Yangzhou. Next slide, please. So here you find a non-exhaustive list of the novelties which have been introduced between 2010 and 2013, which were not only policies. And actually this shows that the local government took very seriously many of GTZ recommendations and tried to push really for an overall reform of the approach, the general approach to urban renewal. And I could say that even the old city office is itself a product of those recommendations. But I have to say at the same time that nothing of what came out in those years can be directly and exclusively connected to GTZ work. Rather, the things that you find listed here in the slide represent sorts of hybrids or adaptations, which are the results on one side of different types of forces, and on the other side as sources of inspiration. And for instance, we find the experiences of other Chinese cities from which Yangzhou learned and took a lot of elements in the definition of its own policies and administrative arrangements and projects. And this, again, has been also confirmed in much of the literature on policy transfers. But what matters most, I think, in this story is not only whether something new has been introduced and whether the transfer has been effective, but also what the characteristics of these novelties are, and in particular about the stability of the sustainability of these novelties. And here I shift to the third question of the presentation, which precisely explores the rooting or institutionalization of what has been learned in this process, and so the sustainability of transfers. Next slide. So to let you understand what these outcomes represent today, I can begin by telling you that nowadays the old city office is a marginal organization that does not have an important say in current renewal projects. It still participates to the planning process and to the formulation of relevant regulation and policies, but whether its opinions are followed or not, it very much depends on the willingness of those who are currently running the project, despite actually the local regulations set a very specific central role for this office. With the change of top city leadership, the old city office has lost its central position it used to have, and the competence for old city conservation and renewal was shifted in the hands of the city districts, which have other priorities and sometimes also other concepts of urban conservation and urban renewal. And therefore, it's very hard to guarantee the persistence of those policies and those plans which I have just introduced before. So we can conclude basically that whatever those regulations, plans, and policy documents were issued in the early 2010 were saying was basically useless. And I'm actually using the adjective of a local official who commented on what was happening after those years. And this is because what counts at the end of the day, they say to me, is the decision of the city leaders. And in particular, in 2015, when I left the fieldwork to return home, a series of literally crazy redevelopment projects had been planned by the city and by the district leaderships, and these were pushed through. So when after I've learned this, and when I wrote my thesis, actually, I concluded by saying that Care for Urban Renewal had been thrown in a garbage can, and that there were many obstacles to the learning process which had been initiated by the project of international cooperation and that these obstacles depended very much on the inferior position that the laws and the regulations have vis-a-vis the rule of man in the specific political administrative system in China, as well as on the ways in which other departments and other organizations which have a voice and a role in urban renewal understand, first of all, their role as administrators of public goods. And I could say this understanding was quite distant from promoting a reasonable conservation of the old city, and also an improvement of the life conditions and housing conditions of the residents. So for those spots in 2015, there was no hope actually of the conservation and care for urban renewal. Next slide. Anyway, the story does not conclude here. And I can say that when I returned to the fieldwork in April 2018, to my grand surprise, those projects had been halted, and the renewal sites, which have been selected by the city leadership and the district leadership, were left all intact. I actually learned that the project had been strongly opposed by a part of the residents who rather wanted to apply the careful method of renewal. So residents began also appropriating themselves of the policies which had been established by the old city office. And the local leaders also understood that they could not force them to relocate without incurring in punishment. And the reason why they stopped the project was basically that the central and the provincial governments were paying at that time particular attentions to episodes of demolition and forced relocations. And so they had the city government had to avoid any type of clash with the residents. I also surprisingly discovered that the district government was also continuing a project which had been initiated by the ex-director of the old city office in 2013, in which she also tried to apply solutions for the careful renewal of a specific neighborhood in the old city. And 3 years before, in 2015, when I left the fieldwork, I knew that there were no certainties about the possibilities for this project to go ahead, because it had lost the support of the city leadership. But then, as I said, when I returned in 2018 and in 2018 later on, I really saw that some progress has happened and that this project was really carried forward. So all in all, I could conclude that careful urban renewal is still there. The project of this, let's say, the product of this long transfer and local translation process, and also that thanks to specific individuals finding themselves at important decision-making positions, this learning continues to take place. Namely, care for urban renewal is still alive in the ideas of the officials and the administrators who are currently conducting projects and who are putting those ideas into practice. And as such, it has become, so to speak, a sustainable, basically, concept or a sustainable paradigm of urban renewal. However, in a certain way, I really don't know whether this interpretation is entirely correct. And here I go basically to my final conclusions. And because I actually have a lot of difficulties in providing a clear answer to the question which is set here in the slide, which is basically, does all this new development mean that care for urban renewal has become sustainable? So final slide, please. So, as I said, this model has still a place in Yanzhou. It is there, but I have to say it is also very weak. And it is weak vis-a-vis the arbitrariness of the city leaders, despite the laws and regulations shall establish certain limits to the range of maneuver. At the time of inquiry, this range of maneuver was limited because the central government paid, as I said, attention to residents' protest. But this, I also have to say, that can change a lot if new policy priorities are set. So, in general, we can say that even if, similarly to any other country, policies are kept and implemented as long as there is political willingness, as long as there are supporting budgets, and also as long as there are even good budgetary motivations to maintain them. In China, the barriers that exist also to hinder local leaders' action are weaker, and as such, these can, let's say, abrupt changes in the direction of urban development, urban redevelopment can really happen due to these weak barriers. Therefore, with these elements in hand, I cannot really say whether care for urban renewal has become sustainable in Yanzhou, has been rooted in Yanzhou. We have to hope, actually, that the central government continues paying attention to the conservation of the old city, as it has been signaled in 2016, when President Xi made a very harsh critique vis-à-vis the demolitions of old neighborhoods in the past decades. So with this kind of endorsement, we can say the care for urban renewal has the chance to survive. But we don't know how long this will last. Moreover, other reforms which are not depending from the local government are needed to sustain this process, this local process of policy learning, because many policies still need to be introduced or revised. Therefore, it is very difficult to say whether there exist the conditions to continue supporting a process of paradigmatic change, which is nonetheless very important to sustain the path introduced in Yanzhou and continue exploring this idea of sustainable urban development. So for now, I can say that uncertainty reigns. And here I have concluded. Sorry if I took too much time. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you, Julia, for that very fascinating case. I really like how you sort of repackaged the paper entirely with this more compelling puzzle. Maybe I should start first with my questions, and I will eventually ask our panelists to also ask questions. I actually just have two comments that are related to the questions I'm going to raise. The first one is, like, again, I'm fascinated by this longitudinal analysis of a policy transfer case. It allows you to really sort of like tease the different mechanisms by which it occurred from the start to the contemporary contemporary issues that you've mentioned right now. And the second comment that I like is, like, definitely you're addressing an important gap in the literature when you look into the persistence of the transfer and whether it's sustainable or not. So I think I only have one question, or more like suggestion, that this would sort of like be related to the paper that you actually submitted. And I was thinking of is there persistence, or why is there no persistence? And one thing that Kingdon, or the subsequent application of Kingdon's multiple streams framework suggests, is that within this longitudinal time series that you have, is that there are probably multiple couplings and multiple decouplings. By this, you've already established that there are three streams, like policy, problem, and political stream. And it seems like when you said that the political will, or the political support to this policy matters, it seems like the most important stream that allows for these three streams to converge or to couple is the political stream. And when the political stream is not ripe or it changes priorities, then it decouples. I think that gives you a very interesting and very contemporary application of Kingdom's model that is applied on a very longitudinal series, from agenda setting to even to evaluation and new forms of agenda setting. So maybe Kingdom's model might be appropriate here, but you also talk about other instances where there might be some like path creating actions, and by that, like, it would probably make this urban renewal concept fairly path dependent. And I'm thinking about the work on Paul Pearson, that in terms of two things. The first is learning effects, that you mentioned here, that when the national government banned all these forced evictions, that automatically the urban renewal sort of like model is used as a sort of like a substitute to the projects that they have. So this is sort of like a learning effect, that this is automatically becomes an intuitive matching of the problem with the policy, with the solution. And the second component here that I think is quite interesting, and I think it will dovetail to comment, is that there is a creation of constituency, and I think there is support from the residents, if I'm not mistaken, because the residents protested to these forced evictions. And because I was wondering, like, before, when they were thinking about the evictions, were there a lot of negative sentiments from the residents. And I was thinking maybe this protest is indicative of the sort of creation of interest groups around urban renewal policies. So maybe I can leave it at that, and maybe you can just react on whether the MSF framework might be able to be an important explanatory model for your case in terms of persistence.
Thank you very much, Kiji. Yeah, well, the paper that I have shared with you basically stops at the specific moment of this process, because it's very difficult to tell. It's a huge story. It's a long story, which I have published in a book, and I also had to cut a lot of details from that. But I basically, in the paper that I have shared with you, there is really this idea of looking at the mechanisms that lead to from something that has been transferred via a cooperation project. What is actually that makes it then become an item, an interesting item for the policy agenda, and then to start trigger a process of policy change. And when GTZ left and joined, the few years followed the departure of GTZ, it was not really sure at all that this process would have happened. So I focused specifically on what has made possible actually for these foreign ideas to find then a place in the local agenda. But for this, let's say this other version of the paper, for sure, we have to think about a new research framework. And for sure, the idea of using Kingdom is not bad per se, because of course Kingdom himself has focused on agenda setting, but there have been a lot of discussions then by the persons who follow this model about the possibility of using his approach also to report, to analyze other moments of the policy process, and in particular in combination with other approaches. And the article by Michael Howlett, Pearl, and McConnell is, for instance, an example of how to integrate basically the multiple streams framework with other frameworks, which allow actually to analyze these different moments, these different phases of the policy process. And I also thought, yes, you really pointed out correctly at, Paul Pearson with the question of path dependency. I mean, one of the interesting aspect of this case is precisely that of understanding the role of temporal factors in the process of policy transfer, which is, as far as I know, a question which has so far, there have been some contributions, but it has been poorly explored. And so checking and talking about politics in time, or really considering the frameworks which take into account these temporal dimensions, would be also a very good idea. Did I cover all your questions, or is there something missing? You were talking about the residents and residents. Yes, they are a very important also part of the story, because at the very beginning, especially when this model has been tested for the first time, they were not interested in participating in the pilot project, because they rather had a wait-and-see attitude, because they knew that anyway, whatever type of effort they made in their housing, this would have been vain, because they knew that the local government, from a moment to another, would have decided that that is a redevelopment zone, and basically asked them to relocate within very short time. So nobody wanted to participate. But as soon as then the government started introducing new approaches and new policies and applied this in different sites of the old city, people basically saw what are the effects in certain neighborhoods, and so they started asking and demanding for to apply this same model in their own neighborhoods, especially when they knew, they were aware that their site, their neighborhood became a renewal site. So they were really important, of course, in the process of appropriation and this question of persistence and performance of the model of urban renewal. But of course, there is the capacity of the model to maintain, to be sustainable, very much depends on the political willingness, and so this political stream plays a fundamental role in in supporting this process of paradigmatic change, so that when this is missing, basically learning stops and sometimes it returns back. There are U-turns, so we return back to past practices, past paradigm of urban renewal.
So very, very great points that you actually raised. I think a related question, I'm going to just read out from Richa here. She's asking, I think in relation to the discussion about performance, for careful urban renewal to really be effective, shouldn't the citizens be involved from early on? And I wanted to ask a sort of like an add-on question about the discussion you have about paradigmatic change, or paradigmatic change. And I was wondering, is this truly a paradigmatic change, or is it more instrumental learning? So I was just thinking, like, is it having different sorts of solutions in hand, the change, or is it really complete change in how things should be solved? Because I think that's how the paradigm is seen here by Peter Hall. And I'm going to close out with another question after your answer.
Okay. Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, Richa, yes, the participation of the citizens is very important in the process. This is a participatory model of urban renewal, and so for it also to let's say to grant its rooting or to permit its application in Yanzhou, you really need the participation of the citizens, and this is actually one of the core questions with which the old city office has been grappling in these years, because they have been testing the model in some sites, and they saw that the current set of standards, or the policy that they had established in in this time period between 2010 2013 was not sufficient actually to convince the people to participate, and actually because participating means first of all spending money on renovating their own housing. And so what they've been telling me is that they've been constantly trying to experiment to try and with different standards or set of subsidies, because actually this policy is based also on offering subsidies to encourage families to renovate, and their design of these policies is very much based on interacting actually with residents, seeing what are their preferences, or seeing actually what they would like to see or what they would like to achieve when engaging in a process of renovating their own housing, and so trying to actually change the instruments to fit or to suit more to the demands of people. And this they do it with a site-to-site approach. So they design an area, they initiate a project with a specific area, and they start discussing with the residents. And so it's very much based. I mean, the persistence and the performance of this model is really very much based on resident. On the voice of the residents or their preferences. When it comes to the question of paradigmatic change, I actually thank you for this question, because at the very beginning, when I had to define the object of transfer, what is actually care for urban renewal, it was very difficult to say what it is exactly, because it contains technical ideas, but it also contains policy ideas. It contains it contains also, let's say, recommendation on how to manage the policy of urban renewal, who has to administer the policies. And so it requires actually changes on a variety of aspects, which do not only cover instruments or policies per se. I'm thinking about the categories of Peter Hall. So you have first order change, a change of instruments, second order change, a change in the level of policies, and then third order change is really a change on policy goals. And I really think that then at the end of the day, also looking at the literature on this, the original literature on this German model of urban renewal, the planners actually define it as a new paradigm of urban renewal, because you really have the government basically introduces a very different focus of this policy. So I haven't really said it so much in the presentation, but the original model, I mean the old models against which then care for urban renewal developed in the 1970s in Germany, was a state-centered model of urban renewal in which the state planned and designed, defined certain areas as renewal sites, demolished, located all the residents in the peripheries, demolished all the buildings, and then reconstructed new buildings. At that time, it was very much state-led and also with a lot of state funding. And this is actually what happened also in China when basically I started analyzing this case. And so the model of care for urban renewal really changes completely the policy goals and the approaches, because the old model of urban renewal, it's a model which basically has as its main purpose the modernization of the city and also the transformation of the functions of the city. So from all residential function to commercial and touristic functions. Care for urban renewal, it's a resident-centered approach. It's an approach which basically puts the residents at the center. They have to be the focus of the renewal. So the idea is not to change the functions of buildings, to keep a lot of residential buildings, or see what residents want to do with the buildings and try to identify with them a strategy or certain, let's say, ideas to revitalize the neighborhoods that first of all responds to the residents. And here the state intervenes only marginally. It intervenes by trying to facilitate the planning process, by providing funding for infrastructural changes and some subsidies to the families. But then who pays are the residents. And depending also on different situations, I mean, they tried to design at the time policies for households which had more problems. And so in that case, they tried to give more subsidies. But it shifts very much, it changes a lot. And that's why I think that using this idea of paradigmatic change, also in line of with what the urban planners who studied the German model said, is quite of a good way actually to try to encompass or understand what care for urban renewal is about.
May I now call on Armin to ask this question?
Sure. I was just wondering whether care for urban renewal ever gained the status of a model experiment in China, and whether other governments, like local governments, came to visit the place and maybe replicated elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Absolutely. I mean, this is so we know both how policy making and experimentation in China works, and also Kiji before made a similar comment that they have this approach of making some experiments locally, and then when it's functioning, when they see it works well, they try to promote it elsewhere. Yes, Yangzhou has become nowadays, and this I observed this is particularly in the last two fieldworks that I did in 2018, 2019. It's a constant site of visits of delegations of officials coming from the central, the Ministry of Housing and Urban and Rural Development, the MOHURD, and from the provincial branches of these ministries, but also from many other cities elsewhere in China. And as far as I know, I remember that at the end of 2017 and early 2018, the MOHURD, this Ministry of Housing and Urban and Rural Development, initiated a tour of all the cities in China which had been established at the central government as historical and cultural city, and they made a tour visit of the country to see basically what was the status of this historical quarters in many cities. And they have been they wrote a report which was extremely critical of a lot of cities, because there has been a lot of demolition and destruction of the heritage and of old quarters, while Yangzhou has been highly praised by the central government and has been, I don't remember exactly whether it has took the status of model experiment, but I remember having read an article in which the ministry has been promoting and has been praising the model of Yangzhou, and probably these visits from everywhere from China, but also from abroad, because I read some articles, some newspaper articles of cities from Syria visiting Onyanzhou to study its model. I also saw that some people, some officials in Yanzhou, they also flew to Manila, and they try to promote actually, or to talk about their own approach in an international conference. So there is now a lot of let's say activities of promotion, dissemination of this model via the promotion of the central government. And I have also to say that the ex-director of the Old City Office is also connected to a central government think tank, which also makes studies on the protection of old cities. So she's also been very active on diffusing and promoting the experience of Yanzhou elsewhere.
Thank you, Julia, for that comprehensive answer. So I don't think we have any more comments. So maybe we can conclude our panel and our session for today. I would like to thank everyone for attending our session. And on behalf of Julia, who organized this panel, we would like to extend our thanks to the speakers who've shared their time and their effort in actually presenting for this panel. So thank you and have a nice day to everyone.